All right, we are up to topic 3.7 of the APUSH curriculum. Title for this one is the Articles of Confederation, a topic I know you've learned about before, and we're going to go through kind of the where it came from and then where it went, so to speak, and what happened to it. So let's get into our first question here. The guiding question is, what were the characteristics and limits of the Articles of Confederation? So characteristics and limits of those articles. Let's jump into it. So the first thing we're going to do, before we even get to the articles themselves, we're going to look at the states and how either during the Revolution or shortly thereafter, they developed their own constitutions. This is something that some Americans don't realize, that yes, we have a federal constitution, but there's also state constitutions. And if you look at those early state constitutions, they have a lot of similarities. The idea that the power of the government comes from the people. So this is a very much like a Rousseau idea of a social contract. Many of them had a Bill of Rights, which our original Constitution did not have until they amended it after ratification. Many of these required annual elections because they wanted people who represent the people to be answerable to the people. In other words, every year you'd be up for re-election, and therefore you have to be very careful about how you're doing the people's work. Otherwise, they're going to vote you out. Most state constitutions had a very weak executive branch, a very weak judicial branch, and most of that power was given to the legislature. All right, now, Articles of Confederation time. Let's get into some details. So the Articles of Confederation was originally adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777. This is, right in the middle of the Revolutionary War, just a year after the Declaration of Independence. It would not be until 1781, which is, towards the very end of the war, when all the states have ratified this and adopted the Articles of Confederation. So in other words, it's ready to go basically right as soon as we finish up this war against Britain. There would be 13 states, and these 13 states were pretty much totally sovereign, totally independent, in other words. They had rights and privileges that modern states don't have. They could make their own money, they could raise their own military forces, they could put tariffs up, they could conduct foreign policy by sending out diplomats. They really truly acted as 13 individual countries that worked loosely together in a confederation. That's what a confederation is, guys. So it's a loose alliance. So, some of the problems of the Articles of Confederation, let's get into some of those problems, of which there were many. So, just kind of on a general note, as I said a moment ago, it's a very loose alliance. Some states didn't necessarily feel bound to help other states necessarily. The Congress that was put into place was cumbersome and clumsy and weak, as we're going to talk about here in a second. Judicial matters were left up to the state, so there was no Supreme Court as we have today, and there was no executive branch, so there was no president or any other chief executive you can describe. There wasn't a chief, like a head of state, in other words, under this Articles of Confederation. Some other weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation: every state had the same voice regardless of population. Congress couldn't collect taxes. That's a really important one right there. And if you wanted to change the Articles of Confederation, every single state, that means all 13 would have to agree. If you want to pass a new law, a supermajority of 9 out of 13 would be required to agree to pass that law, which means laws were not very frequently passed, obviously. So to sum everything up here, when it comes to major problems with the Articles of Confederation, you need to remember that the national government that was established was just too weak. It was largely powerless. The states had all the power. In fact, you can argue way too much power over matters, and they didn't always agree. Now, you could look at this and say, well, geez, what were the Founding Fathers thinking? This is so dumb. Why didn't they see this coming? But remember, they had just rebelled against a national government, that's, say, Parliament and King George, who had all the power, and they felt that they couldn't go back to a system like that. They had to go somewhere in a different direction, and perhaps you could argue they went a little too far in the other direction by making the government simply too weak. So far the articles sound kind of, useless and problematic and maybe a waste of time, but in fact they're not. So we're going to think of some positives. We're going to go over some of them here in a second. So, a couple of positives. Number one, yes, the government was weak. But if you look at the rest of the world at this time, that's actually a really good thing. Almost all the major countries in the world at this time were absolute monarchies, right? Many of them preaching the message of divine right, that God had chosen that king as the ruler, and therefore the people really shouldn't have a whole lot of power. So yes, our government was weak, but compared to the overbearing governments and most of the rest of the world, particularly in Europe, that's actually not a bad thing. And it's a stepping stone to something better. In other words, it was not really practical to go from having no major government to having the government we have today. There had to be something kind of in between to serve as that buffer between nothing and what we have today. Now, one of the things that's going to push the Articles of Confederation into the trash bin will be something called Shays' Rebellion. This takes place in 1786, so just a handful of years after the Revolutionary War. And this takes place in Massachusetts. So you had a lot of poor farmers living in Massachusetts, particularly in western Massachusetts, who were not doing well economically. And this is a reminder that the Revolution, while it did give us independence, it also brought all kinds of economic problems. Most Americans, honestly, economically speaking, were worse off after the Revolution than they were before the Revolution. And these poor farmers, many of them couldn't pay their taxes, they had huge debts, and many of their farms were being foreclosed on. And so a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays, that's his picture down here, decided that he was going to do something about that. So he and his followers, known as Shayites, demanded that the government begin to print paper money. Now his plan for this is more money would equal more money in circulation, and that would lead to inflation. And the reason he wants inflation is debts don't adjust for inflation. So if prices go up and the money value goes down, it's actually easier to pay back your debt. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. We're going to talk about that much later this year, and it'll make more sense then. Basically, inflation equals it's easier to pay back debts. That's just easy rule of thumb. He also wanted lower taxes, and they wanted an end to the foreclosures. Now, the Shayites march on some of these courthouses and kind of take over as a mob, basically. And wealthier conservative members of Massachusetts were panicking about this. And they're thinking, okay, what do we do to hold on to law and order? And so basically the wealthier citizens form a militia of sorts. There are a couple of skirmishes and pitched battles. There is some bloodshed. It's not major. This is not the Battle of Gettysburg or something, but there is actual violence that breaks out between the two sides. In the end, the Shays' Rebellion fails. The militia is able to be called out and put down the rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion is important because for a lot of people who are skeptical of the common man's ability to rule and make good decisions, this is just evidence of the fact that they couldn't, right? This is, if you were wealthy and powerful and elite, you would look at this and say, see, this is what happens when the commoners have too much political power. This is what happens when the government's too weak to maintain law and order. So in other words, they feared mob rule. That's what mobocracy is, mob rule. And so it showed that we have to do something to strengthen the national government to prevent these type of rebellions from happening again. All right, so now our next big guiding question is going to be what were the effects of new land laws in the West? So we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about something called the Northwest Territory. Now, this seems like it's very separated at first glance from our topic of the Articles of Confederation, but it's not. There are two key land laws that dealt with the Northwest Territory that were passed by the Articles of Confederation. And these two laws are going to have long-reaching effects. They're going to last long after the Articles of Confederation are long gone. So this here in purple, guys, is what we call the Northwest Territory. Now, when you think of Northwest today, you think of places like Washington State or Oregon or something like that. But this is the original Northwest, or what we eventually will call the Old Northwest. And you can see the modern-day states right through here that would include. Just a little bit off topic here, there was a plan that Thomas Jefferson had to divide up this Northwest Territory into these rectangular states and give them very flowing names like Sylvania, which means woods, or Polypotamia, Metropotamia, and Saratoga for that famous battle during the Revolutionary War. This doesn't come to fruition, of course. These states don't exist, but there will be at least a little bit of legacy with this idea of carving this land up into blocks. So let's look at the Land Ordinance of 1785. It was decided by the Continental Congress, by the Congress, that the Old Northwest would be sold off in blocks to help pay down the national debt. We had huge debts to pay down after the Revolution, and this would bring government money in to pay down that debt. Well, if we're going to sell it off, we need to have a system for this. And it was decided that we would divide the Old Northwest into these things called townships, which are 6 square miles. So inside one township, you have 36 1 square mile sections. That's what these things are called. These blocks are called sections. And then the entire Northwest would be surveyed and divided like this, and then you would sell these territories. So someone might buy a section, they might buy a half section, might buy a quarter section, a quarter section. There's lots of different ways to divide this, but it would be very regulated and almost kind of like a metric system, where everything's divided into one another. And you can see here's the very first land that was surveyed that way. Each individual block is called a township. That area right there, there's your township. Those are those sections I was talking about a moment ago. Now, interestingly enough, there is one section per township, that will be sold off to raise money for local schools. So this is not just about dividing land, it's also about building public education into the system. So this is kind of the old way of doing things. East of the Appalachians, where farms are just kind of a jumbled mess of random shapes. And then here will be farms under this new system, where it's, again, very rectangular. Now, if you've ever been to the Midwest, or maybe you remember flying over it or something, you will see something that looks like this. And this is a legacy of that system. I lived for a time in rural Ohio, and it was just like this. You lived out in the middle of nowhere, basically, and all the roads in the country were all one big square mile block. So it would be like 1 mile up here, 1 mile there, 1 mile there, and so forth. That's how it worked. All right, so let's go to our second of our land laws. This is called the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. What this law does is it establishes the procedure for creating new states out of this Northwest Territory. So there's 2 phases in this land law. Phase 1 is where the area is called a territory. So there'd be the Ohio Territory, the Indiana Territory, and so forth. And when that area is under territorial status, that's under the direct supervision of the federal government, and there's no state government, so to speak. Then, after you get to 60,000 people, they can become a state. Well, they can apply for statehood from Congress, and Congress can let them in. Now, the key ingredient in this is when you are admitted as a state, you get total equality with the original 13 states. So there's not going to be some sort of hierarchy of states based on when they were admitted. For example, Virginia is not going to have more power than Ohio just because it was an older state. All the states will have the same power, basically. One more thing, this is really important, guys. The Northwest Ordinance, no slavery in these territories. The exception would be slaves that were already present when this law was passed, but going forward, no more slaves in. Now, how do you remember the Land Ordinance versus the Northwest Ordinance? Well, the way I think about this is I think about Northwest Ordinance, N-O, no slavery in the Northwest. That's just how I remember it. But those are your 2 big laws, guys. And again, both of them come from the Articles of Confederation. Both of them deal with how we're going to divide up that territory called the Northwest Territory. All right, that is it for this topic, guys. And I'll catch you in the next video.